Satellite coming down in 3, 2, 1.
Go, go, go!
Battlefield is a franchise spanning more than 2 decades. It is not surprising that in that period, there are die-hard fans of the older titles, even going as far back as the Refractor Engine era, who consider them better than recent ones. And there are newer players who only started playing the series within the past few years who have missed out on the old experiences. In recent years, there have been increasing calls throughout the community from both of these groups to have certain past Battlefield titles remastered. This is no doubt partially fueled by nostalgia, but also by disappointment with recent launches, and an ever-increasing difficulty to play those older titles at all. But there is so much more to consider about remastering a past Battlefield game, and in this case, logic must triumph over desire. So the question stands, should there be a full remaster of a past Battlefield game? There are many issues to account for when talking about a game remaster, and it is so much more than just cost. Let's look at exactly what fans want. Over and over, I see on YouTube, Twitch, Reddit, and Twitter the demand for a past Battlefield game remaster. These usually range from Battlefield 3, a very high point in the series, to Bad Company 2, a major divergence, to even the refractor titles of Battlefield Vietnam, Battlefield 2, or the futuristic and ambitious Battlefield 2142. Occasionally, I'll see a few numbers for Battlefield 4, but the line can be drawn here. So pick one, anyone, and whichever you choose, I guarantee you will encounter the exact same issues. The very first thing one must consider about remastering past Battlefield titles is their immense complexity. I would make the argument that from Battlefield 2142 onward, the intricate details, amount of in-game mechanics, and the totality of stat tracking and UI functions in-game, or on the menus, only ever grew in scale. This barely scratches the surface of how weapons worked, vehicles performed, and the balance between them. So many complex rules and coding governs each Battlefield game, and to attempt to remaster a single one of these would require the inclusion of every single feature, tool, utility, or mechanic that makes that game as it was. And that isn't even including some legacy bugs that make those games unique. Battlefield is, among many other things, a game not just of infantry play, but of aircraft, tanks, and in some cases naval warfare. Each of these rules must be perfectly replicated in a remaster, and if the original game is any indication, the process is supremely difficult to get right even on the first main attempt, with years of support behind it. If the track record of any Battlefield release is considered, one must assume that a remaster will be buggy on launch and require significant long-term support just to iron out the kinks. And in this process, changes that a studio makes now may differ greatly from the solutions implemented years ago, resulting in markedly different gameplay. Yet, when we consider the complexity of most Battlefield games, especially Battlefield 3 onward, there is another problem on the opposite end of the spectrum. If we hypothetically remaster Battlefield titles from the Refractor Engine era, Battlefield 1942 through 2142, we encounter an issue of oversimplification versus what players demand in the current era of gaming. Let's make the assumption that either Battlefield 1942, Battlefield Vietnam, or Battlefield 2 is remastered. In each of these titles, a faithful remaster will limit the equipable weapons total to no more than 1 per class in Battlefield 1942, usually up to 2 per class in Battlefield Vietnam, or up to 3 per class in Battlefield 2, assuming you had everything unlocked. Tanks and aircraft would not receive upgrades of any kind, and most importantly, UI innovations, movement improvements, and modern gunplay would be non-existent, and remain extremely primitive. While there are certainly old-school gamers that would jump on this train in an instant, I have a feeling the minimalist nature of these older titles would result in a player count drop purely out of boredom and frustration, even if they were perfect replicas. Battlefield 2142 is the only Refractor Engine game that truly stepped up in terms of complexity, and even though there may have been improvements to movement, stats, and UI, players would still be limited in terms of weapons and functionality. The second thing to consider with a remaster is how it would be done in the first place. There are two options here. Option 1. A classic Battlefield game is remastered on the original engine or something extremely similar, and purely receives an overhaul in terms of textures, resolution fixes, UI upgrades, server stability, and minor optimizations. The game will utilize the majority of the original game's code and feel extremely similar. Option 2. A classic Battlefield game is remastered on a modern engine, from scratch. It will feature stunning new graphics and attempt to rebuild the original game piece by piece as accurately as it can be. Each of these options has significant downsides. To start, there already exists mods for both Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield 2 which substantially upgrade the game textures, although they can't be used in a game client on a server without that mod. Some 1942 mods even go as far as adding ray tracing, which is impressive but a bit funky. Any remaster of the original game on its original engine may give players the most accurate feel, but it comes with the same baggage. If there were bugs left in the original game, there is a debate on whether these should be fixed or left as is because the fanbase is just used to them. While maybe not the worst thing in the world for the Refractor Engine games, the Frostbite era titles and their intricacies make bug handling or game improvements far more problematic, and legacy issues will undoubtedly creep in. Remaking a past game on a newer engine is a whole nother can of worms. In essence, a team will have to build a Battlefield game from scratch, utilizing new tools and software to try and emulate the original game as closely as possible. For a single-player game, this might be a reasonable task. For a multiplayer game, it's daunting, especially one like Battlefield. A different engine can result in new and wildly problematic bugs which take extended periods to resolve. Different map-making tools might result in level design not feeling quite right in scale to the original. And a change in the physics engine means that emulating vehicle controls or balance is almost impossible, particularly for aircraft. This option would no doubt take far longer to remake every asset in the game and take liberties with the original game design to offer changes and improvements to an obsolete system, which fans may or may not hate. Then there is factor number 3 to consider, which would need to be addressed with both of these remaster options, and that is servers and game server customization. Since Battlefield 1, DICE has slowly but effectively stripped players and communities of the ability to run their own servers as they see fit, with custom utilities, plugins, and APIs which allow servers to do a multitude of new things. If your desire is to remaster a Battlefield game prior to Battlefield 1, this needs to be discussed. Whatever studio is developing the game would either have to take the modern approach and have their own list of servers which they provide, or take the long road and remaster, or more accurately, rebuild the server-side tools which came out along with the original game, without which custom servers as well as mod support ceases entirely, a major selling point of the older titles. I don't necessarily blame DICE for this shift away from community responsibility, though I personally hate it and wish server-side tools would return. This is a trend in nearly all modern game development, and Battlefield is merely another victim of this simplicity and standardization. Therefore, it seems almost a guarantee that any remake of a past Battlefield game would feature significantly scaled-down server options, locking players to the vanilla version of the remastered game. If players are okay with this, then go for it. Point number 4 to consider with a remaster is a big one: scope and scale. Battlefield games are huge, both in the way they operate but also in the content they possess. Numerous weapons, vehicles, secondary mechanics and game modes, and hugely multiplayer maps take years to develop pre-release and then years after post-launch. Most Battlefield games prior to Battlefield 5 contained upward of 30 multiplayer levels by the end of their lifetimes. And therein lies the question: in a remastered title, where do you draw the line? It is impossible to bring back everything. Certain features, weapons, and especially maps might need to be cut, and there is no guarantee of post-launch content of a remaster of this type. Most likely, a limited, predetermined set of maps will be decided on early, and this will form the majority of these remastered maps. Then there is the issue of a single-player campaign. In addition to the difficulties of just getting a remaster to function properly, if the title chosen is Bad Company 2, Battlefield 3, or Battlefield 4, fans will undoubtedly ask about the inclusion of a campaign remaster. This massive task might be eliminated altogether for the sake of resources and time. And additionally, the inclusion of a campaign also requires greater effort of post-launch support should bugs appear in this mode. Given the size of Battlefield titles in their original forms, it is an inevitable certainty that any Battlefield game remaster will be a hugely scaled down version of the original with substantially fewer maps and overall content. Consideration number 5 is about the potential legacy design decisions, bugs, and overall feeling of a remaster. As mentioned earlier, Battlefield games are hugely complex, and the amount of bugs and stability issues a typical title has on launch can be staggering. It is also important to remember that no Battlefield game ever ended its run in a zero-bug state, and some were abandoned in far worse shape than others. This should be expected for any remaster as well. However, this is not the only problem going forward. Depending on how it's made, there are several legacy bugs, design decisions, glitches, and performance problems which will creep up, and a decision needs to be made on whether to leave those bugs or features in the game, or whether there should be an attempt to address them now. For example, Battlefield 2 had really blocky movement following a major patch, and it consistently had some of the worst hit registration ever. Battlefield 2142 tried to push the envelope with what the Refractor engine was capable of. It nevertheless had sometimes unpredictable vehicle movement and jittery physics. Battlefield 3 had immense levels of suppression, a blinding sun, and extremely low tick rate servers, resulting in players trading kills frequently. While the Venice Unleashed mod made a strong case that Battlefield 3's problems could be solved, it is still up for debate if these things would be fixed or improved with a remaster. The argument here is whether a Battlefield remaster should attempt to improve the old games in minor ways. Improving netcode, movement, physics, resolving legacy bugs, perhaps even making balance adjustments decades overdue. But while these improvements may benefit the game overall, its definition as a remaster comes into question. At what point do you just consider it a mod of its former self, or a new offshoot Battlefield entirely? While newer players experiencing these games for the first time may enjoy the nuance of such a legacy title, older gamers with experience may cry bloody murder. The 6th point, which must be considered about a Battlefield remaster, is whether it is worth it in the grand scheme of things. From a studio perspective, cost and project scope are the huge drivers here. Whichever way a project like this is handled, it will likely require the efforts of a full studio over several years. Game remasters have sort of been a trend lately. We've seen remakes of The Last of Us, Resident Evil, StarCraft, Command & Conquer, Warcraft 3, Age of Empires, Crysis, Dark Souls, Diablo, Grand Theft Auto, the list is endless. However, I see two trends in the massive list of game remasters. First, that the vast majority of them are story-driven, single-player experiences, and second, that the popularity and hype of most of these games dies off incredibly quickly, with few exceptions. Game remasters are done for primarily 4 reasons. The title has a huge nostalgia hook. It has a large fan base. The studio sees the product as a work of art and wants to perfect it for itself. Or because the analytics predict a short-term profit. Nostalgia is often the biggest motivator for sales. A few chords from a game's theme or updated frames of an epic cutscene can generate huge pre-order numbers. But what happens after the fact, after release? In case after case, the player retention drops sharply a few weeks after launch, and most people, save for the diehards, let it sit uninstalled in their library for ages. This is due to several factors, ranging from reality differing significantly from the way players remember it, to the game's replayability factor, to the most important point in this whole discussion, that players have been here before. Oftentimes, the gamers purchasing the remasters of a title are those who have played it the most. They know every detail, every bug, every nook and cranny, so what is new for them? Usually, nothing, and that's the rub. If we look at a potential Battlefield game remaster, players will be playing the same game they were 10 years ago. The same guns, the same sounds, the same maps, both good and bad, and the same bugs, probably along with some new ones. Regardless if the game has 20 maps or 5, chances are that most of the game's player base have been playing them for years. There is a chance that an old map might get upgrades in the form of new flags or map assets to cover some of the barren terrain, but this also might upset some die-hard fans. In truth, whether a game is remastered on a new engine or updated from an old one, between nostalgia of the player and changes to the game, there will always be a significant portion of players that end up feeling that the Battlefield remaster just isn't as good as the original. Changes, large or minuscule, ranging from physics alterations to server tick rate improvements to original features left out, to just the movement not being perfect, will be noticeable, and there will be countless players who end up stating, "This isn't quite right. This remaster isn't complete. This isn't my Battlefield." The vast majority of these issues with remastering a Battlefield game have already been demonstrated through Battlefield 2042's Portal mode. Portal, a self-described love letter to the community, is a custom mode framework allowing players to create widely varying game modes of their own, utilizing a range of adjustable settings and across 3 loosely remastered Battlefield titles, 1942, Bad Company 2, and Battlefield 3. I will cover Battlefield Portal in far greater detail in another video, but for the current purposes, we can use it to illustrate the vast complexities of remastering a game. Battlefield Portal's inclusion of maps, weapons, modes, vehicles, structures, and most importantly, intricate game mechanics from those respective titles give a decent representation of those games. But in truth, each of these comes across as a pale shadow to the original. And what makes the situation worse is that the intention was not even a remaster of each title in any sense of the word. It is simply a replication of past mechanics, some of which don't even work, on the current 2042 engine. Even if, on occasion, the mode does provide players an enjoyable experience, especially as an alternative to the main 2042 game, it nevertheless comes across as a half-baked mod, which in fact it is. The Battlefield 1942 Portal experience is by far the most complete, if only because it had the least mechanics and weapons to port. Yet, over time, more World War II weapons have been added to flesh it out, for exactly the reason stated earlier. It's too simplistic. And yet, there are mechanics from Battlefield 42 missing from Portal. The Bad Company 2 Portal mode faced a huge backlash at launch, since the game's weapons had a wild spread in recoil. When explained by the devs that the values for these weapons are directly as they were in the original, players still couldn't believe it. There was a mismatch between nostalgia and reality, and this demonstrated the effect of the same values on a newer modern engine. Things don't work the same. Things don't feel the same. Then there was Portal's Battlefield 3. Here, the complexity of the original Battlefield 3 clearly made it the most difficult to recreate. Vehicle assets were missing. Vehicle game mechanics, weapons, and physics were completely different from the original. Guns are missing which players wanted. Audio for these are different and often worse than players remembered, and behave differently as well. On top of all of it, the UI changes make it difficult to understand what you can change and when you could do it. Finally, the scale of the Battlefield 3 maps feels different from the originals. Smaller, in a way. I don't mean to shaft Portal so hard at this time. It is evident that attempting to remake the mechanics of 3 Battlefield games at once was a terrible overreach. But the flaws of the designs provide examples of why players would be dissatisfied with any full remaster. Players will always want a full Battlefield recreation, carefully developed for years and released as a standalone title for purchase. But in the end, after looking at all these questions and points, is it really something that would turn out well? Something that you would play long term? Something that a studio would commit to? Chances are, it would also likely find itself competing with the launch of a major new Battlefield title soon after, and lose even more of a player base. It would be an interesting experiment, for sure, but not one which is sustainable or even reliable. There is, however, one more point I'd like to make. There technically has been a Battlefield remastered once before, and that is Battlefield 1943, which was console exclusive and was the second ever Battlefield game developed on the Frostbite engine after the first Bad Company. Originally announced as a console game, which would later be ported to PC, which it never was, Battlefield 1943 serves as sort of a tech demo for the Frostbite engine and its feasibility on console hardware. It never appeared to be anything more than a minor remaster of 1942, featuring remakes of only 4 of that game's maps from the Pacific Theater. However, once again, remastered isn't quite the right term, as 1943, fun and well implemented as it was not 1942. It was missing numerous weapons, vehicles, and original features, yet made changes to the classic gameplay or added entirely new mechanics altogether. This, of course, doesn't even begin to take into consideration the missing 90% of the original title. Once again, this doesn't make 1943 a bad game, quite the contrary. But it again demonstrates the differences from the original, and the challenge of defining what constitutes a Battlefield remaster. In the end, it is a no-win scenario. Between the long-term investment needed for development and post-launch support, complexity of Battlefield games in general, and the near impossibility of recreating a title, the limitations of scope and scale, questions regarding servers and legacy features, and overall conflicts with gamer nostalgia, it just isn't a road worth going down. And don't get me wrong, as someone who has been around the Battlefield series from the very beginning, I too have often wondered about the feasibility of, say, a Battlefield 2142 remake. But the fact of the matter is that it is far better for a studio to commit its full time and resources to a true, accurate, and faithful sequel while providing something new as well. And I believe this is what the community largely wants more than anything else. Faithful sequels, inspired by the originals, with a commitment to honor the past. I fully believe in remastering old school maps, weapons, vehicles, and certain mechanics into new games. That remains each game's legacy, and they should have the reverence to be recreated properly. In that regard, a remaster of any single past Battlefield title, despite the nostalgic desire, is illogical. It just isn't worth the effort or the inevitable disappointment.